Welcome to another video from English Matters. Today I would like to focus on question number 3, which is the structure question. What confuses some students is what exactly is meant by structure. I mean, structure essentially is how a text is pieced together, how it is put together, how it is organized effectively, really. What happens at the beginning, how it progresses to the end. Of course, in your exam you will have a beginning or an ending of a text. You won't have the whole thing. But your typical question is going to look like this. Question 3, you need to think about the whole of the source. There's a lot of reading. Remember, there's only 8 marks for this question, so you should spend about 10 minutes maximum on it, really, maybe a little bit more, but not too much. Really, you mustn't steal any time from the questions that where more marks are available. Anyway, this is a typical question from a past paper. You need now to think about the whole of the source. The text is from the beginning of a short story. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? So that's the key question. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could underline those terms, structured and interest, because that is essentially what we're writing about. You are then given further guidance by a series of bullet points. I would address each bullet point in order. You can get into the nitty-gritty of the text and sort of identifying structural features, but I would identify and do each bullet point in order, please. That's how you should do this. So if you look at the first bullet point, you could write about, I don't think it'd be you could, it should be you must write about. Could sounds a little bit too wishy-washy for my taste. What the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, bullet point number 1. Okay, I have a text here which is The Tiredness of Rosabelle. It's by Catherine Mansfield. It was used in the exam, I think, a couple of years ago, I believe. Source A, of course, you only get one source with paper 1. Now, look at that first bullet point again. What the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source. So let's look at the opening paragraph of our source. So here is our source. Now remember the question, that first bullet point which we address is what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source. So let's read that first paragraph. At the corner of Oxford Circus, Rosabelle bought a bunch of violets. And that was practically the reason she had so little tea, for a scone and a boiled egg and a cup of cocoa are not sufficient after a hard day's work in a hat shop. As she swung onto the step of the bus, she grabbed her skirt with one hand and clung to the railing with the other. Rosabelle thought she would have sacrificed her soul for a good dinner, something hot and strong and filling. So that's our first opening paragraph. So how does the writer structure this opening paragraph? What are they trying to achieve here? What you've got to remember with a narrative theory or narrative ideas is that texts are usually built up into, usually you get a beginning, which usually establishes character and setting. So that's a structural feature. Then that usually moves on. You get kind of a rising action, where you get a kind of things begin to get interesting. Then you get a climax where the character is forced to address something or deal with something before you get the ending, which is kind of like denouement, or where things are kind of wrapped up, kind of coming down, if you like. I don't know if you're going to get the full gauntlet of all those things in just an extract, which is the beginning, but you certainly you could talk about the beginning or introduction. Anyway, so let's look at the opening paragraph. So the first sentence, so look at it sentence by sentence. You get the beginning and the introduction. At the corner of Oxford Circus, Rosabelle bought a bunch of violets, and that was practically the reason she had so little tea. For a scone and a boiled egg and a cup of cocoa are not sufficient for a hard day's work in a hat shop. It's a long, multi-clausal, rambling sentence. You could say structurally, the beginning of the text interests us because it introduces us, not only it establishes its setting, where this takes place, it also introduces us to a character. But structurally it's interesting as well because it uses a long rambling sentence, hyphenated sentence there, to emphasize how busy her life is, and perhaps how digressive her mind is, which is going to set us up for the rest of the text. It also establishes that she's hardworking. It introduces the reader the concept that she is a working girl, she's hardworking, and also that she's very hungry. Structurally, this is important because as the narrative progresses, her life is then juxtaposed with the customers that come into her shop. So structurally that's of interest. And the second sentence is two very long digressive rambling sentences. As she swung onto the step of the bus, she grabbed her skirt with one hand and clung to the railing with the other. Rosabelle thought she would have sacrificed her soul for a good dinner, something hot, strong and filling. So it establishes the fact she's very hungry, which suggests to the reader that structurally this is interesting because obviously her poverty is perhaps important for this text. So that's why and it interests the reader. That first paragraph interests the reader because it generates an interest in Rosabelle and makes us want to read on. So that's what I would say about the opening paragraph addressing bullet point 1. Let me get on to the next bullet point of your question. How and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops. So a good way to approach is to look at it paragraph by paragraph. What is being done paragraph by paragraph as we progress through the text. Now, as I said, you've only got 8 minutes for this, 10 minutes, for this question. So you're not writing a wonderful detailed exposition. You simply do not have the time. But so the second paragraph, Rosabelle looked at the windows. The street was blurred and misty, but the light striking on the panes turned their dullness to opal and silver. And the jewellers' shops seen through these were fairy palaces. Her feet were horribly wet, and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat would be coated with black greasy mud. There was a sickening smell of warm humanity. It seemed to be oozing out of everybody in the bus, and everybody had the same expression, sitting so still, staring in front of them. Rosabelle stirred suddenly and unfastened the two top buttons of her coat. She felt almost stifled. Through her half-closed eyes, the whole row of people on the opposite seat seemed to resolve into one meaningless staring face. Now, structurally, this is interesting because it's telling us, it's interesting for the reader because it's telling us explicitly about Rosabelle's life and how she thinks. It establishes straight away a desire to be elsewhere. She looks out of the window. The street was blurred and misty, but the lights around the panes and their dullness, opal to silver. The jewellers' shops seemed as if they were fairy palaces. It almost has a dreamlike quality to it before the narrative switches back suddenly to the here and now and her current situation. So structurally, it's setting up essentially a character that perhaps desperately wishes that her life was better. And the reason that's done structurally, of course, is because obviously then she is forced to juxtapose her life with other people she's met in her shop and to reflect upon her own existence, which is what is interesting for the reader, what sort of conclusions she draws from that. And also, the next paragraph, you get a flashback. Now, you get a series of flashbacks, especially one where we talk about the redhead girl entering the shop. And flashbacks are structurally very interesting. Structurally, flashbacks interest the reader because they are structural devices, in effect. They are structural devices. And the idea then is that past events are then superimposed upon the present narrative, the present tense. So we're looking back. And you've got to think about why are we looking back. So we move away from the very claustrophobic atmosphere of the second and third paragraph to a certain extent. So then we get this wonderful flashback, and the flashback, again, it kind of mirrors her thoughts. It interests the reader because the flashback is anchored to the beginning of the text, which was talking about fairy palaces. And then we get the girl with the beautiful red hair and white skin and eyes the colour of green ribbon, shot with gold they'd got from Paris last week, as Rosabelle had seen her in her carriage. It's very much continuing on with this kind of fairy tale escapism that Rosabelle indulges in. So structurally, it's interesting that the redhead girl comes in at this point. So we get this rising action and this climax. The climax really is very much with this girl coming into the shop. So you talk about beginning, rising action and climax and denouement of this enough text. These are all structural features as well. And the idea is the The reason why this is interesting is because structurally it draws the reader's attention to a series of contrasts to be made with this text. That's why it is interesting. Contrasts between Rosabella's mode of transport, this horrible claustrophobic smelly bus, in comparison to the girl in the red hair and described almost like a princess in her carriage. We were forced to make those sort of contrasts. We make contrasts between the life that this girl lives, jetting off to Paris last week, compared with the life that Rosabelle has to live. We then get this discussion between the characters, which is structurally is also interesting because it displays sort of haughtiness and distance, almost an otherworldly quality, in the sense that Rosabelle exists. She understands that now that she exists on the margins of this world. So that is structurally interesting as well. So that is a point to be made. It's establishing a series of contrasts. And if we look at the last paragraph of this text, a sudden ridiculous feeling of anger seized Rosabella. She longed to throw the lovely perishable thing in the girl's face and bent over the hat, flushing. This is kind of like a climactic moment for this passage. It's exquisitely finished off inside, madam, she said. The girl swept out to her carriage. The verb swept here is wonderful. It's almost like a sense of being carefree, like a breeze, really, a kite on a windy day. But the last sentence, shall I go straight home, put it before I come out to lunch with you? Rosabella heard her say. Now this is interesting as well because it has a cyclical structure. It reminds us of the opening paragraph, and the opening paragraph establishes how hungry Rosabelle is. Now the next question on this question 3 is, any other structural features that interest you? So what are other structural features you need to think about? Well, for example, structural features are things like identifying shifts in time, i.e. flashbacks. That's a structural feature. You need to identify things like that, why that flashback interests the reader, what it brings to the narrative, and why it interests you as a reader. Movement in thought. Does the mind of the character sort of move from one topic to another? You could argue that in the first 2 paragraphs we get a lot of that with Rosabella. So structurally it's interesting that her mind jumps from one topic to another. It suggests how, and structurally you could say it's there to suggest how busy her life is, with these sort of the minutiae and the monotony of her working life. Another one is zooming in from something big to something smaller. Zooming in from something big to something smaller. Well, look at the opening paragraph 2. Rosabelle looked out of the windows. The street was blurred and misty, but the light striking the panes turned the dullness to open silver, and the jeweller's shop seemed as if they were fairy palaces. This zooming out creates a dreamlike impression, which is structurally then juxtaposed with the reality of her working life. Then it switches. Her feet were horribly wet, and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat were coated with black greasy mud. So you can see what's happened there. The writer has zoomed out to take the reader on kind of a journey into the inner thoughts of the character before switching back to juxtapose that with the very mundane and grimy reality of her life. So that's a structural feature as well, it's worth mentioning. Introduction of characters. When characters are introduced, you must think about how they are introduced and why they are introduced in that way. Another structural feature, of course, is combining external actions with internal thoughts. Something might be going on, but something is happening in the mind of the character. For example, you might get a line like, she handed the dress to the customer and smiled, thinking all the time about the party last night and how Veronica seemed over-attentive with Michael. So you get that sort of switch between the performing of an action combined with a sort of an internal monologue. That's an interesting structural feature as well. Why is that there? You've got to think about, why does that happen? Switching between different points of views of characters and the narrator. Sometimes with 19th century texts you get the omniscient narrator, like Dickens' A Christmas Carol. How does Dickens' commentary on what's happening is there any kind of distancing or irony between what the narrator says and what the characters say? That's an interesting structural feature as well. Repetition, you need to look at things like repetition, if something's repeated, of why it's repeated, what point does that serve. A circular structure, does this something at the very end of the text remind you of something at the very beginning? So a circular structure, that's a structural feature. And also look at sequential markers that move the narrative on, things like first, secondly, thirdly to begin with, furthermore, in addition, words like that which progress the narrative, they're structural features. They're things you could comment on. So to reiterate then, you need to think with a text, how does this structurally interest you as a reader? You need to address the bullet points in order, what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes the focus, so in this case it's the flashback, and any other structural features that I've just mentioned that you can pull out. It's a big ask of you. You do have only about 10 minutes for this question, but they're the sort of things you need to be focusing on when you're talking about structure. Essentially how the text is put together, how it is organised. Anyway, so that's the all I'd like to say about this. As I said, you need to that's all I'd like to say for this question. If you've got anything out of this video, I hope you have. Please do like, subscribe and share, because I need to build up my subscribers. Once I get 1,000 subscribers, I've only just started this channel really, once I get 1,000 subscribers I can then monetize my channel, make some money off it, and then hopefully that will give me the time to make more videos more frequently. Anyway, good luck with your exam. Thank you for watching.